Good morning, students. I thought I'd do an initial reading of Hills Like White Elephant by Ernest Hemingway, the same way that I did an initial first analytic or critical reading of Emily Dickinson's poem, which is also due for today, for this week. So again, remember that the purpose of an initial reading is to gain some impressions. I don't think it's cheating for sure to think about, and I think it's helpful to think about the elements of fiction. That's why I paired this week's reading with that short web article on the elements of fiction. I think it's important to think about, to have in the back of your mind, if you will, how fiction works, what its characteristics are, what its elements are, so that as you gain impression on your initial first reading, you have something to guide you. And I think being able to guide you is really important. And I would argue that you really don't have to go outside of the text in that initial first reading if you keep in the back of your mind what that guide is. So remember, what we're working with generally with fiction is plot, what is happening, what is the story, setting, where is it occurring, and when, character, who's acting, who's involved, conflict. Conflict can arise. It's through juxtaposition, through dramatic irony, through interaction with character, plot, what have you. And generally, conflict is action. Symbol, that is deeper meaning. Plot can be symbolic, setting can be symbolic, titles can be symbolic, character descriptions can be symbolic, conflicts can be symbolic. Symbol really is something deeper than what it's standing for something else, figurative language. Point of view, that is the narrator who's telling the story. What kind of a person is telling the story? Is it a person? Generally, you have first, sometimes second, although that's very rare, and third person narrators, and then within that you have a range. And then themes, and again, I like to think of theme as the takeaways, how all of these things work together to create meaning, or to suggest some ideas that the story is, or the poem, the story here is trying to get you to think about. So I certainly want you to keep in mind how these elements work, that they do work, and generally that writers are after certain things when they make these choices as you do your initial reading. And then what you're going to do is you're going to develop impressions based on each of those kinds of areas. And I want you to take notes. I want you to annotate the text. I want you to think about those things. I want you to keep track of them. That's what those discussion questions certainly are designed to do, is to point you to these sorts of things in that initial reading. So we're going to do that. So let's start with plot. Obviously, you have to have read the story to talk about plot. Plot is the story itself. It's what is happening in the story. So I think the plot here is pretty simple, and I think that adds to and is connected with other things. You have a man and a woman who are having they are waiting for a train to Barcelona, to Madrid, from Barcelona to Madrid, in Spain, and they're at the train station waiting for that train, and they have a conversation. They have a conversation about an operation, and the man tries to convince the woman that they should have this operation. She should have this operation, and she seems resistant. It ends with no resolution on the conversation. What's interesting here about plot is we seem to be thrown in the middle of something, and I think that's very, very important, and that's connected with other things as well. We don't get the beginning of the conversation. We don't get the beginning of their lives. We don't get much of that stuff, and then we don't know what happens after this. So in some ways, this is like a portrait, and that's pretty classic Hemingway. It's and we'll get to this when we get to point of view. So I think those are some things to think about with plot. Why do we start right in the middle? Something's happening. It seemed to have started somewhere else and it'll end somewhere else as well. And what we get here is right in the middle. We get a portrait. And I think that's important. So we can also then talk about setting. We talked a little bit. It's a train station. And I think it's important to think about the symbol of a train station. We talked about this with a at a station at the Met, or in a station at the Metro by Ezra Pound. What happens at train stations? People are waiting to travel. They're on a destination. The train station is not the destination. It's the place where people come from and go to. That's really important here symbolically. How does a train station represent? Well, it's also a crossroads. And that, you see how that connects with getting thrown right into the middle of the story. They've come from somewhere and they're going somewhere, and what we get the portrait at the train station. So it's movement at the same time that it's at this moment that they stand still and you can see it, just like life. So in some ways it's symbolic of life, but it's also symbolic of their lives together. They are at a crossroads with this conversation. There's a conflict that's happening. So that's important. Other setting, it's happening in Spain. When is it happening? Obviously it's happening. You'd have to do a little digging. I mean, it could be today. I don't think it has to be when it happened, except to know that when we're dealing with the plot, the operation is an abortion. It's I'm not going to say it's not controversial now, but certainly it was much more controversial 70 years ago, 80, 90, 100 years ago, for sure. So they're in Spain. They're taking a trip. They're on vacation. They have a jet-setting lifestyle. I think that's very important to think about when you think about setting. All right, so character. I think character is really interesting here. You really have three characters. If you exclude the waitress, you have the man and the woman. It's hard to think about protagonists here. Some people might suggest that the female character is more of a protagonist than the male character. I think that's interesting. I don't know that that's entirely substantiated, but it's interesting for sure. But I think what's interesting, what we have to think about here is what are they called, right? The woman is the waitress. It's called the man, and then the girl. All right, he's called the American and the man, and she's called the girl. I think that's really, really important. What does that say about the relationship? Why is the narrator telling it that way? Why is it? Well, obviously, there's something symbolic there as well about how they're called. Her name is Jig, which is kind of a dance. He's called the American, so it's really interesting to think about that. And so we can talk about the relationship between the characters. We can then talk about conflict. Where does conflict arise in the story? Well, conflict began off stage. And so what we have here is we have a sort of a calm before the storm. But there's quite a bit of tension happening here. All right, so they're drinking, which is interesting. She's pregnant, but she's drinking. It's hard not to bring our contemporary lifestyle into this. The idea that you couldn't drink and smoke and do other sorts of things, like have intercourse, etc., while someone was pregnant is a relatively recent thing. Sex science is really only started in the 1950s. So we can't really say, oh, she's abusing her child, because they didn't think about that at the time. But if we're talking here about conflict, right, it's bubbling under the surface during this entire conversation, right? Do they look like white elephants? They often hear the woman brought 2 glasses of beer and 2 felt pads. She felt the pads and the beer glasses on the table and looked at the man and the girl. The girl was looking off at the line of hills that were white in the sun, and the country was brown and dry. There's a little bit of a setting there as well, right? One side is fertile, the other side is infertile or dying, right? Life and death, which connects obviously with some symbolism of the setting, but also with the conflict and the theme that's going on. They look like white elephants. I've never seen one. The man drank his beer. No, you wouldn't have. I might have. Just because you say I wouldn't have doesn't prove anything. So here's where we are. already sort of that conflict is bubbling up in the conversation. Yet everything that they have conflict about seems to be unstated. That is, they're talking in circles around each other, and I think that's interesting when we can come back to theme. All right, the girl. So we go a little bit further talking about this. And they're basically just having a conversation about drink, and then again we get, yes, said the girl. Everything tastes of licorice, especially all the things you've waited so long for, like absinthe. Go cut it out. You started it. I was being amused. I was having a fine time. Well, let's try and have a fine time. All right, I was trying. I said the mountains looked like white elephants. Wasn't that bright? That was bright. I wanted to try this new drink. That's all we do, isn't it? Look at things and try new drinks? I guess so. The girl looked across the hill. So what you see here is conflict and tension bubbling up. And in some ways, I think that if we think about conflict and character, we can also talk about other things. But I think it's interesting whether or not this is a realistic depiction of perhaps the way people talk about things. Think about your real life. How often is it that you confront people directly if you have a problem with it? How often is it that we have honest, frank conversations with each other? Especially, interestingly enough, with people we really deeply care about. Not too often. It's much more common that we talk around things, that we leave things unstated. I know that that's definitely true in some of the relationships that I've had, even close friends. I think it's interesting that we probably share more about honesty with people we know less about because there's less to lose, right? And so in some ways, it's a very realistic kind of conversation, and that'll connect with point of view. So everything right now is bubbling up. We really don't hit conflict here until, boom, it's really awfully simple operation, Jig, the man said. It's not really an operation at all. I know you wouldn't mind it, Jig. It's really not anything. It's just to let the air in. The girl did not say anything. I'll go with you and I'll stay with you all the time. They just let the air in, and it's all perfectly natural. Then what will we do afterward? We'll be fine afterward, just like we were before. What makes you think so? That's the only thing that bothers us. It's the only thing that's made us unhappy. So what we have here is the man who's pressing her to have an abortion. She's not so sure. He's convinced that they will be able to go back to the way it was, which is the lifestyle that he wants. But obviously, this is a child growing in her bosom, in her stomach. She's giving life. She has life inside of her, so it's a little more complicated to her, obviously. So she wants reassurance, and I think it's the best thing to do, and I don't want you to do it if you don't really want to. And if I do it, then you'll be happy and things will be like they were and you'll love me. I love you now. You know I love you. I know, but if I do it, then we'll be nice again. And if I say things are like white elephants, you'll like it. I'll love it. I love it now, but I just can't stand it. You know how I get when I worry, right? And he's being selfish here. I want you. I don't want to share you, right? So there's a little bit of manipulation going on, right? And then we could have all this, she said, and we could have everything, and every day we make it more impossible. What did you say? I said we can have everything. We can have everything. No, we can't. We can have the whole world. No, we can't. We can go everywhere. No, we can't. It isn't ours anymore, conflict. All right? And this all obviously ends up here where they're having a conversation, and she says, would you please, 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 please stop talking? He did not say anything. Okay, so there's the conflict. There's where it comes to a head. And it's interesting because she says stop talking. That is the resolution of the conflict, at least for their conversation. So what we have to think about is what is this conversation representing? Is it accurate? Is it it's asking us perhaps to think about the ways that we do and don't really communicate with each other, especially about really, really important things. All right, so let's jump from symbol. We've already talked about that. Let's go into point of view. I think it's clear from the beginning what kind of point of view we have. Let's go all the way up to the top. The hills across the valley of the Ebro were long and white. On this side there was no shade, no trees, and the station was between two lines of rails on the sun. Close against the side of the station there was a warm shadow of the building, etc., etc. And then we get, what should we drink? The girl asked. Right. So what we have here is a classic third person omniscient narrator. Right. An absent narrator. We have a reporting style as objective as you can possibly get. I shouldn't say omniscient, more objective narrator. This narrator seems to want to report things. But it's interesting because what we still have the narrator as a character, that as an absent character is deciding what to tell us and what not to tell us. Okay. So it's interesting to think, and because of that, we don't get a lot of detail about the man or the woman or the girl. We're asked in some ways to read between the lines. This is classic Hemingway. Hemingway had an objective reporting narrative style in which we're asked to, quote unquote, read between the lines. That is, do a lot of interpretation. That doesn't mean that we can make it mean what we want it to mean, but we have to dig for clues. We have to pay attention to details because they're all there. He's just not going to say, hey, look at this, the way, for instance, the narrator in The Story of an Hour did. She was interpreting things that the characters didn't know. Here we don't get that, and so it's a very different kind of point of view. And we have to think about why. Part of it is just what Hemingway chose, but part of it is as well. Right, so we can then jump to symbol. I mean, obviously sticks out on the page. What is hills like white elephants? Hills like white elephants. It's both referenced in the story. It's also symbolic. Here I noticed in a lot of the discussion questions when I asked what the title was, most of you seem to be able to sort of indicate that a white elephant is sort of an unwanted gift. And I'm curious as to whether or not you do that. For instance, white elephant present at Christmas, or if you did a little bit of research, and that is that a white elephant is actually a historical thing that's rooted in certain cultures. If you obviously drew from the lesser, and that is the concept of a white elephant gift, that may be common knowledge. If you, however, did not know but looked up or did research about the second iteration of the white elephant, and that is that it's a gift that you can't get rid of. You have to just feed it and feed it and feed it, and it's so rare in albino elephant that you have to care for it until it dies, but you have to keep it up. That's part of the cultural obligation, and so you can't give it away. You just have to accept the obligation. If you went and looked up research on that, you need to cite that. That's all I'm saying, even if it's just shmoop.com, because again, what I want you to do is I want you to go to good sources. And so anytime you do research, anytime you do any kind of reading at all, you need to acknowledge your sources. And then my job will come in and say, hey, maybe you shouldn't use shmoop. Here's a source instead. But anytime you do that, you have to cite those sources. So we have setting. Everything is sort of tied into this notion of a white elephant. It's symbolically, but we also have one other sort of what I would say the symbolic representation of communication. This is also connected a little bit with where we get lost a little bit here in the conversation. There aren't tags here. The fact that we jump right into the middle of a conversation and then we don't know what happens at the end. I think this story is asking us to think about whether or not we actually are able to deal with conflict with each other. That is, that we're able to talk through our problems, or if we're all just in it for ourselves, and that's just part of life. This also I think connects with the story of An Hour when Mrs. Mallard realizes her husband is dead, and she is overwhelmed, but then a sort of a joy comes to her that realizes that she's on her own and she can live her life, and then that's ripped from her. In some ways, you have something similar here. It's told in a different way. So communication, something about communication, and I think there are ways that you can play with that. But but that it's definitely here. So if you were to sort of think about that as a theme, you'd have to think about how it connects with plot, with setting, dialogue, with character, all those sorts of things. And that's what analysis is, and that's where theme hits us. Theme is the color of the thread that seems to be woven throughout the entire fabric of the piece. So you can't just say theme is we shouldn't have abortions. You can't say that. I mean that's not in the text. The text does not tell us that we should feel bad if we're pro-life or pro-choice. That's not a theme. But the idea that these things in life, these really important topics, can we ever really look beyond what we want, what we need, to be able to work with other people to solve them, or do we just have to act the way we're going to act, and we're sort of limited by that? That's a theme. You could talk about that, sure, but then again, you'd have to talk about conflict, character, setting, plot, point of view, etc. All right, so once again, what we have is an initial, so this is what I would call an initial critical analytical reading, and that's what I want you to be doing, is using the elements of fiction or the elements of poetry to guide the impressions that you have based on these things. And then we're gonna work with this. This is all gonna sort of make sense as we move towards actually making an argument about something, which is that first essay that's coming up. You have a draft due week 3. But at this particular moment, just pay attention to each story as a story. But I'd also like you to start thinking about connections between the things that we're reading. Notice that I referenced a couple of the things. 3, I referenced a poem, the At a Station of the Metro, and I mentioned or referenced Story of an Hour. So start thinking about connections that you see between things. I think that's an important thing as we accumulate knowledge as well. Like always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thanks, and I'll be back with you soon.